Saskatchewan native Candace Savage writes wonderful stories about her prairie roots and about flora, fauna, critters, and real-life characters. Her new book reflects on a homey little town in a nest of wild hills and how the West was really one. It is not a happy tune, but it is a riveting story called A Geography of Blood. It is my pleasure to welcome Candace Savage to Vancouver, and congratulations on being nominated for the nonfiction finalist, the Nonfiction Award, big award, one of the biggest in Canada, if not the biggest.
Well, it's the second biggest now, and it's a thrill to be on this very distinguished shortlist.
I know you write a lot about prairie people and prairies and animals and crows and things like that. What led you to write about the prairie landscape in A Geography of Blood? How did it begin?
It began about 11 years ago with a visit to this little town of East End. We were there, my partner Keith and I, because the East End Arts Council, in this town of 600 people, there's an arts council that manages an artist's residence called the Wallace Stegner House. So we had booked in to stay there for a couple of weeks, and we were at that time driving an old rattletrap of a van. Every time we tried to leave town, it broke down, and we found ourselves on the end of a tow truck being dragged back into town. This actually happened 3 times before we got the message, which seemed to be, would you just sit still and pay attention to where you are?
A sign from the gods.
From something. When we did pay attention, we realized that this was a very striking place. The Cypress Hills, the geologists say, that's what this landscape is. It's called the Cypress Hills. It's in far southeastern Alberta and far southwestern Saskatchewan. And the geologists say that it's an erosional remnant, all that's left of a landscape that used to cover at that depth or height, all of the plains. But everywhere else it's been eroded away over millions of years. So now these hills stand as a kind of repository of memory. So literally and figuratively, they remember tyrannosaurs and 3-toed horses, and they just set your mind to thinking about what's been before.
Exactly, and it wasn't that pretty, some of it, as you know. The decimation of the buffalo, the decimation of the Aboriginal people, all of that.
This is a landscape where you can still see places where the land is hollowed out by the buffalo wallowing. So there'll be, areas of natural grassland where there are still the physical traces of buffalo trails and the buffalo wallows, and there are teepee rings on prominent rises of land. So they're reminders of this very recent other world which has been laid to ruin.
So the stone circles, what were they used for, essentially?
Well, Keith and I now own a house in this little town, and maybe 5 or 10 minutes walk from our house, you can be up on the bench of the valley, and there, when the light is just right, you will see these circles of stones laid out in the grass. And they were used some of them are ceremonial, so they mark out a large circle, but most of them, the stones were used to anchor the skin teepees.
Okay, now back to the Queen's commitment to her red children.
Yes.
What year are we talking? 18?
This is a late 1870s and early 1880s.
Okay, Prime Minister was?
Sir John
A.
Yes, Mr. Canada.
Mr. Canada. And he suggested to the Queen, or the Queen suggested to him, or the idea was if the natives would just be more like us and grow crops and corn and things like that, that they would behave and all would be well.
Everyone could see that in this end of days that the buffalo were being slaughtered, and that the old way of life
by the white guys.
Mostly. There was there was subsistence hunting still going on, and then there was the huge pemmican trade powered by the Hudson Bay Company and the fur trade, and then there was hide hunting, and there was an attempt to exterminate the buffalo to weaken the position of the Aboriginal people. But so everyone could tell that the end of days were upon us, and on both sides of the border, Canada and the US, and there was an impulse towards agricultural settlement. So what had been there had to be gotten out of the way.
Right.
And so in Canada, treaties were signed with the First Nations people, and lavish promises were made that these, things would be fine. If you're starving, there will be help. The Queen, the Queen will deal well with her red children. But eventually, the Canadian government became exasperated with the difficulty of the task they had set themselves. And suffice it to say, they did not live up to the spirit of their promises.
Right, not the Indian commissioner, Commissioner Dewdney at the time, who said, only when the Indian depends on us for everything will we be able to handle him. Not sure, but someone. So what do you want us to gain from A Geography of Blood, to learn?
Well, this is a history in which I have a personal stake, because I am the daughter, granddaughter, great-great-granddaughter of people who broke the prairie sod. So this is my story. And I would like us to understand that when we're telling the story of the colonization of Western Canada, we don't get to start with Grandma in her poke bonnet on the front of the covered wagon going into an empty land. We have to start, at least, with the extermination of the buffalo, with the destruction of the buffalo ecosystem. We have to acknowledge the displacement and the suffering of First Nations and Métis people as part of the story of how we got to be here, of our present day society.
And what is clear in A Geography of Blood is the resilience of the human, of the homesteader, in spite of all.
The resilience of the homesteader, the resilience of First Nations and Métis people, because this book takes you into a heart of darkness and then begins to take you out again. And the way out is through meeting some First Nations people and just getting a sense of how much there still is in those individuals and in the cultures that are a resource for all of us.
What you can recognize in these people, and in certainly anywhere from the Antler Museum to Fort Walsh to wherever you traveled. And what is really interesting for me is your love of East End. Population 600, one coffee shop maybe.
Well, it reminded me a lot of my childhood. It's really, Keith and I live mostly in Saskatoon because he teaches at the university there. But we have so many friends in East End. I mean, there is an open-heartedness about a rural community that really is it's very
It's true, and there's one town
and
gossip who knows everything, usually. Usually. But you put down prairie roots. Well, you've always had prairie roots, but they're deep. And did you read Wolf Willow?
Wolf Willow by Wallace Stegner.
Wallace Stegner.
Yes, he's kind of the patron saint of all writing about the Cypress Hills. So he's acknowledged as a great American writer because he won the Pulitzer Prize and lived most of his life in the U.S., but he, as a young man, lived there. So the artist residence is actually the Stegner family home in East End. But then, there's just so much literature about that part of the world. So many people who before me started to put it into language.
Because he wrote, I think, Big Rock Candy Mountain.
He did.
Did he
Wolf
not?
Willow, yes, both of which touch on that area. Sharon Butala lived there for many years and wrote about it. Guy Vanderhaeg has written novels set in the Cypress Hills as well. So.
Well, cut banks and coulees and Orioles and colors and grain elevators are just a little bit of this story. I thank you for writing it. It's a beautiful book.
Thank you.
And congratulations on being nominated for the
Fanny.
BC's Nonfiction Award. Thank you. Candace Savage, A Geography of Blood, Unearthing Memory from a Prairie Landscape. And remember, you can catch our conversations on YouTube or follow me on Twitter at Fanny Kiefer. There will be many more literary lights to come. Thanks for watching Shaw TV and being with me today.